The Philadelphia experiment is one of the most famous unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. During the Second World War, the countries involved in the conflict were looking for a new way to win quickly and effectively, no matter how fantastic this method may seem. At that time, the U.S. Navy was obsessed with creating the perfect camouflage for the ship, capable of making it invisible to enemy radars and protecting it from magnetic mines. According to some sources, in 1943 in Philadelphia, the U.S. military allegedly tried to create such a ship, but the experiment got out of control and led to the most unexpected consequences. Versions of assumptions regarding the course of the Philadelphia experiment and its results are still expressed, and researchers continue to argue about whether it was a fait accompli, a newspaper duck, or well-developed disinformation. It is believed that with the help of this experiment, U.S. military scientists tried to check whether an ultra-high-power electromagnetic field, especially one generated around an object, can lead to its complete visual disappearance due to the fact that light radio waves begin to bend around it. If successful, the scientific engineers hope to build several destroyers that could disappear not only from enemy radar screens, but literally from sight. In addition, physicists were going to test in practice the unified field theory formulated by Albert Einstein, and according to some unconfirmed data, he himself was involved in this experiment. According to the most common version, the experiment was carried out on October 28, 1943 in the port of Philadelphia. The target was the destroyer Eldridge with its entire crew of 181 on board. To conduct the experiment, 4 powerful electromagnetic oscillation generators were mounted on board the ship, which, according to scientists' calculations, were supposed to create that same invisible electromagnetic cocoon around the ship's hull. From early morning, the destroyer took up a position in the dock assigned to it. The progress of the experiment was monitored from a headquarters ship moored nearby by high-ranking officials of the Navy Ministry, scientists, and observers from other departments located on the merchant ship André Foursat. At exactly 9 o'clock exactly the order was given to start the generators, and within a few minutes a thick greenish haze enveloped the destroyer, and 12 minutes later it disappeared in front of the amazed spectators. Only 4 hours later, the ship appeared several tens of kilometers from the site of the experiment in Norfolk, appearing literally out of thin air not far from its reserve parking lot. It remained virtually undamaged, except that the onboard clock and compass were out of order, which could not be said about its large crew. Most of the sailors died during the experiment, and the death of some of them occurred under extremely strange and unusual circumstances. Most of the survivors went crazy, and when they were found, they were busy rushing along the corridors of the ship with loud laughter and articulate screams, hitting the walls or tearing their hands and faces with their nails. Only 21 out of 181 people returned safe and sound, maintaining their sanity, but it took them a long time to come to their senses after what they saw. All survivors were immediately quarantined and thoroughly interrogated in order to reconstruct in detail everything that happened on the destroyer Eldridge during his absence. Judging by the data obtained, during the experiment on board the ship something happened that scientists had never encountered before and were unable to give an explanation. As a result, according to the testimony of those interviewed, the following was established. Immediately after turning on the generators, all people on board, without exception, began to experience an inexplicable and growing anxiety. When the greenish fog thickened, the anxiety of many grew into panic, and by the time the ship disappeared from the field of view of observers, the horror had become so strong that none of the crew could do anything or make any observations. So many team members have only fragmentary memories and vivid images of what happened. Moreover, at first, the testimonies of the survivors were not even taken seriously, they were so unrealistic and they were attributed to severe stress. But further investigation and a detailed examination of the ship confirmed much of what the sailors said. Some of the dead crew members froze motionless in place in various positions and stopped breathing, turning into an eerie resemblance of statues. Others burned because temperature anomalies arose in several places on the ship. The heat there was such that even metal melted. The lucky ones who managed to escape from such places said that people began to smoke, and their skin turned red and seemed to be split. Some burned for a very long time, according to witnesses, about several hours, although it was not possible to establish this precisely, since the sailors admitted that at that moment they could not adequately estimate the time. Some of the surviving madmen also had burns, sometimes so severe that the victims later died. Some of the sailors were exposed to radiation, which was later revealed during medical examinations and autopsies, while others received severe electric shocks. The 27 sailors seemed to have grown into the bulkhead and structure of the ship, as if human bodies and metal had become one. 2 survivors later said that they saw with their own eyes how people passed through the walls. This is exactly how the bodies that merged with the ship appeared. Some of those who entered the bulkhead froze in the middle and were unable to get out. Of course, the experiment itself and its consequences were strictly classified. All investigation materials, photographs and newsreels, autopsy results and testimony of surviving eyewitnesses were sent to protected archives, and some of them were immediately destroyed. The representative of the U.S. Navy and other witnesses in the case were ordered to categorically deny the fact of the experiment, and to call any information about it fiction and lies. But rumors continued to spread anyway. The Philadelphia experiment first became known to the public thanks to astrophysicist, mathematician, and ufologist Maurice Jesse from Iowa. He did not seek public recognition, he simply wrote articles and books on topics that interested him. In the 1950s, he was especially interested in questions related to the then popular unidentified flying objects, so in 1955 Mr. Jesse published his next book, The Case for UFOs. This work attempts to scientifically answer the question of what a UFO is. It never became a bestseller, but it was thanks to him that Maurice received a strange letter from a certain Mr. Carlos Miguel Allende, who was very interested in the section of the book on the properties of space and time. In this letter, the unknown person claimed that the U.S. military, using secret technology in practice, can, paradoxically, move objects outside the usual space and time. Mr. Jessup asked for clarification. A year later he received a much more detailed letter, which described in detail all the details of the classified experiment. The author of the message claimed that he served in 1943 on the ship Andrew Furist, who was part of the control group of the Philadelphia experiment, and saw with his own eyes everything that happened to the destroyer Eldridge. Here are excerpts from his letter, which was later made public, by Carlos Miguel Allende, New Kensington, Pennsylvania. The result was the complete invisibility of a destroyer-type ship at sea and its entire crew. The magnetic field was in the shape of a rotating ellipsoid and extended 100 meters, more or less depending on the position of the moon and the degree of longitude, on either side of the ship. Everyone who was in this field had only a blurry outline. Everyone who was outside the magnetic field saw nothing at all, except for the sharply defined trace of the ship's hull in the water, provided, of course, that they were close enough to the magnetic field. Yet in it, half of the officers and crew members of that ship are now completely insane. Some, even to this day, are kept in appropriate institutions where they will receive qualified scientific help when they are either soaring, as they call it, or soaring and stuck. This soaring is a consequence of being in a magnetic field for too long. If a person gets stuck, then he is not able to move of his own free will, unless 1 or 2 comrades who are nearby come up and touch him, because otherwise he will freeze. Usually the deep frozen one loses his mind. The enraged person speaks nonsense if the freezing lasted more than 1 day according to our time count. I'm talking about time, but the frozen perceive the passage of time differently than we do. They resemble people in a twilight state who live, breathe, hear, and feel. However, they perceive so much that it seems to exist only in the next world. They perceive time the same way as you or I. Many of the team members who took part in the experiment remained, the majority lost their minds. One simply disappeared through the wall of his own apartment in front of his wife and child. 2 other crew members were ignited, meaning they froze and caught fire while hauling small boat compasses. One was carrying a compass and caught fire, and the other rushed to lay his hand on him, but also caught fire. They burned for 18 days. Faith in the effectiveness of the laying on of hands method was destroyed, and general madness began. The experiment as such was an absolute success. It had a fatal effect on the crew. Of course, upon receiving this letter, Maurice admitted the possibility that it was not an entirely real, but rather an exaggerated account of a mysterious event. And yet, during the Second World War, many secret experiments were carried out. Why shouldn't the Philadelphia experiment be one of them? After all, the letter contained too many real details, geographical names, dates, and events. Maurice could not ignore such a sensation, and immediately began to investigate. I went to the archives, looked for eyewitnesses, talked with military men and sailors, and they say I found a lot of evidence that the experiment took place. And he was finally confirmed in his opinion when he was unexpectedly called to the U.S. Office of Naval Research. The fact is that shortly before that, a parcel arrived there, with an Easter card and Jesse's new book, about an expanded argument in favor of UFOs, all the fields of which were covered with notes in blue, purple, and green ink. The notes contained overt allusions to Einstein's unified field theory, the Philadelphia experiment, the names of the High Command of the U.S. Navy and links to classified documents and materials. Of course, Mr. Maurice was asked to give an explanation. He immediately appeared and, after studying the book, came to the conclusion that the notes in the margins in blue ink were written in the same handwriting as the letters of the mysterious Mr. Allende. According to Maurice himself, employees of the Office of Naval Research admitted to him during that conversation that such an experiment had actually been carried out in 1943, but whether it really was so, we will never know. After this conversation, the search for Allende began in earnest, but he remained elusive, although he continued to regularly write to Maurice. In his messages, he reported more and more new facts from the Philadelphia experiment. He spoke in detail about the field of static electricity that engulfed the destroyer Eldridge, into which he even stuck his hand and survived after that only thanks to high sailor rubber boots. He wrote extensively about the unique force field that moved counterclockwise around Eldridge and its supposed properties. Also, according to him, Albert Einstein himself was present at a certain stage of the experiment. Such letters have been coming for 2 years. Until finally the correspondence was interrupted in the most tragic way. Perhaps the Philadelphia experiment would never have become public knowledge if not for the mysterious and sudden death of Maurice. On April 20, 1959, he was found in his car, suffocated by exhaust fumes. Perhaps he committed suicide due to numerous debts, or perhaps the reason for the sudden decision to commit suicide was a protracted creative crisis. He could not finish his new book, which was entirely devoted to what happened with the destroyer Eldridge. There is an opinion that Maurice learned too much and they helped him die as quickly as possible. However, the police clearly determined that Maurice was very drunk and under the influence of a large number of antidepressants. He himself stretched the hose from the exhaust pipe into the interior of the car, plugged all the cracks, started the engine and soon suffocated. This is confirmed by the fact that shortly before his death, he wrote 2 farewell letters to relatives and friends. But Maurice's cause did not remain without followers. His fellow authors Yvonne Sanderson and Dr. Manson Valentine, immediately after Maurice's death, took up their own investigation with renewed enthusiasm, and soon received results. Thus, some documents were found confirming that from 1943 to 1944 Einstein served in the Navy Department in Washington. It was discovered that there were living witnesses to what happened with the destroyer Eldridge, as well as those who allegedly personally saw sheets of calculations made in Einstein's handwriting. Even an old clipping from some yellow newspaper of those times was found, telling about sailors who got off the ship and instantly disappeared into thin air in front of many witnesses. Having collected this material, Maurice's followers published a book called The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility, in which they used the information obtained, Allende's letters, and all of Maurice's work. Later, 16 more bestsellers and 3 feature films were released. So the Philadelphia experiment, whether it was real or not, gained worldwide fame. So what really happened to the destroyer Eldridge? Was everything described in the book true, or was the imagination of the authors inflated to incredible proportions? Or the experiment really took place, and the hype around the disappearance of the ship was raised in order to hide its real results from the general public? Since the publication of the book, The Philadelphia Experiment, The Invisibility Project, attempts to find out the truth have not stopped to this day. Many believe that everything written in Allende's letters to Maurice and his followers is the pure truth. For many years, the search for the same Carlos Miguel Allende was carried out. Moreover, both independent researchers and journalists and government officials were looking for him. The entry included telephone books, mailing lists from address bureaus, information databases of morgues and police stations, even personal files of military personnel. Dozens of imposters gave interviews, stirring up interest in the topic and telling more and more fried facts about the Philadelphia experiment. At the same time, the American military departments, the White House and the Capitol were literally inundated with letters from concerned citizens who were interested in only one question: whether the Philadelphia experiment happened or not. The government did not immediately answer these questions, thus convincing the general public that the U.S. Navy had something to hide. A refutation by the Office of Naval Research was published only on September 8, 1996 in an official statement, where the experiment was denied as a fact. But interest in the topic did not disappear after the statement, but rather even reached a new level. A lot of refutations from independent experts and researchers appeared in the press and on television. So even now, almost every year, more and more interesting facts about the sensational experiment appear. One of them was the recorded and published story of the American electronics engineer Edom Skilling. In 1990, my friend Margot Resendez invited me and my friends to visit Dr. Carl Leisler, to her neighbor, to discuss some details of the Philadelphia experiment. Carl Leisler, physicist, one of the scientists who worked on this project in 1943. They wanted to make a warship invisible to radar. A powerful electronic device such as a huge magnetron was installed on board. Magnetron ultra-short-wave generator, classified during World War II. This device received energy from electrical machines installed on the ship, the power of which was enough to supply electricity to a small city. The idea behind the experiment was that the very strong electromagnetic fields around the ship would act as a shield for radar beams. When the magnetron started working, the ship disappeared. After some time he reappeared, but all the sailors on board were dead. Moreover, part of their corpses turned into steel, the material from which the ship was made. Leisler and his experimental colleagues believe it was as if they sent the ship to another time. At the same time, the ship disintegrated into molecules. And when the reverse process occurred, a partial replacement of organic molecules of human bodies with metal atoms occurred. Of course, in addition to fans of the story of the Philadelphia experiment, there are also skeptics who flatly refuse to believe both in individual details of what happened and in the existence of the project as a whole. We must admit that their arguments also sound very convincing. So, if you believe Allende's letters and data found later, Albert Einstein took part in the work on the project. Nevertheless, the US government did not trust the genius too much, because it was generally known that he was an open communist sympathizer. FBI Director Hoover issued a harsh verdict because of his radical views. Professor Einstein cannot be considered suitable for use in secret work, since it seems unlikely that such a person would become a completely trustworthy American citizen in such a short time. So at that time, Einstein was assigned only minor tasks that could not seriously affect the course of the war. And in 1943 to 1944 he worked for the U.S. Navy Ordnance Department. It is safe to say that his work had nothing to do with electromagnetism, much less invisibility. The second argument of those of little faith is that, according to the logbook, the destroyer Eldridge could not have been in the port of Philadelphia in October 1943, since it was undergoing repairs at the Norfolk docks. But the main argument was and remains the fact that the sailors who served on the destroyer Eldridge, one and all, deny the fact of the experiment. In 1999, their first meeting since the end of the war took place in Atlantic City. By this time, only 15 people remained, including the 84-year-old captain. Of course, the meeting was not without questions about the Philadelphia experiment, but the captain and the rest of the sailors unanimously answered that they had no idea how this ridiculous story arose. For example, Ed Weiss categorically stated that this could only be invented by smoking marijuana. And Ray admitted that when people asked me about the experiment, I agreed and said yes, I disappeared. True, they soon realized that I was playing them. But facts remain facts. In 1943, many scientists in all warring countries were concerned about the safety of sea vessels. Then a lot of experiments were carried out to protect the ship from the recently appeared magnetic mines and torpedoes. Such a procedure could make battleships and destroyers invisible to them. According to many researchers, the legend of the Philadelphia experiment created by Miguel Allende could be based on one of these experiments, which at that time was carried out, including in the port of Philadelphia. It offered two possibilities: multiple amplification of the ship's magnetic field so that the mines would explode in the distance, without causing harm, or neutralization of the ship's own magnetic field, so that even the most sensitive mines would not go off. The first method presupposed the presence of huge electric coils on board the ship, abundance of wires and equipment. For protection, according to the second option, the steel vessel was equipped with a special belt, carefully selected personally for it, surrounding the entire hull. A current was supplied to the belt, making it a powerful electromagnet that neutralized the ship's magnetic field. By the way, after experiments, it became clear that the last option worked better. It is not surprising that many stories appeared among sailors about such mysterious cases, where the facts were generously flavored with fiction. In addition, the procedure for demagnetizing a ship and changing its own magnetic field was at first a strictly secret military development, so there was a lack of facts about such experiments. But there were plenty of rumors. Probably Miguel Allende saw a similar procedure somewhere or heard about it and came up with the missing, incomprehensible equipment, huge machines, and a secret government experiment that could impress and inspire anyone. Over time, it was explained how the idea of invisibility and the disappearance of the ship could come into his head. Investigator of the Philadelphia phenomenon, journalist John Keel, wrote in his book that during World War II, a magician and specialist in organizing spectacles proposed to the U.S. Navy to make their ships invisible. Perhaps the magician had in mind some kind of trick or a special disguise, but at that time his proposal received wide publicity in the press. It is very possible that Allende saw these articles and invented his story based on them. Another, no less convincing version says that Maurice made a fuss about the Philadelphia experiment not by accident, but with the aim of spreading misinformation in order to hide the real facts about the experiment and, most importantly, their results. But whether Maurice wrote, as they say, under the dictation of officials of the U.S. Navy Department, or whether he himself was a victim of misinformation cleverly launched by the unknown Mr. Allende, researchers differ. Will the mystery of the destroyer Eldridge ever be solved? It is impossible to answer this question unequivocally. Time passes and fewer people remain alive who could claim first-hand knowledge of the facts. It is quite possible that the truth will disappear into oblivion along with the witnesses or those who call themselves such. Or maybe it will forever settle as a dead weight in the depths of some archives, in a folder marked top secret.